Well, so good to see such a gathering tonight. I'm John Klaus, and I'm the program chair for the League of Women Voters of Ames and Story County. And this month's program is called, Is Our Democracy in Peril? What Would the Founding Fathers Say? And our presenter is Professor Dirk Deam. He's a lecturer and professor of political science at Iowa State University. He is educated as an aerospace engineer and did several years as a rocket scientist. He's also a lawyer and a professor for 21 years at Iowa State. He teaches constitutional law, a history of democracy, and all the things that we need to know as we answer that question, is our democracy in peril? And what is our democracy? So, Professor.
Thank you, John. Thank you, John. Thank you, Story County League of Women Voters, for inviting me tonight. I have long been in awe of the work of the League, does to maintain and improve the integrity of our electoral system and to educate and empower American voters, so I am honored that you would ask me to speak tonight. I hope my remarks in some way contribute toward your noble charter. When John asked me to speak a couple months ago, I inquired about what sort of thing he was looking for. He said there was concern within your organization that recent events and political developments might suggest our democracy was imperiled. But he also expressed uncertainty about that, and he wanted perspective from someone who teaches American politics and constitutional law, clarifying whether there's a serious problem we should all be concerned about, or whether this is just part of the normal struggle of American politics. To hint at where I'm going tonight with that question, let me show you one of the books I teach from in my Introductory American Politics course. The book is by the political scientists Thomas Mann and Norman Ornstein. If you can't see that, it says it's even worse than it looks. That book came out in 2012. Here's the latest version of the book that came out in 2016. If you can't read it, it says it is even worse than it was. In times where every statement about public matters gets framed by partisan suspicions, it's hard to get anyone to listen to serious observations about our political system. That's as true for students in a college classroom as it is for people generally. What I try to do to get my students to listen and to learn is to set aside the issues of the moment, at least for the moment, and focus instead on the particulars of our constitutional scheme. Mark Twain wrote, "A classic is a book that everyone praises and no one reads." I find that's true of the Constitution, too. We brag about the Constitution. We beat each other over the head with it, but I see little evidence that most Americans actually know what it says. In an outcome that may be of some hope to you, I find that when students finally confront what our founding documents say and why they say it, those young people are much more able to come to terms with our present troubles. That's the project I have in mind tonight. I've been asked whether our democracy is in peril. To at least set the stage for answering that question, to provide, hopefully, some clarity on the matter, I've decided to approach the question the way I usually do, with reference to what our founders had in mind in the documents and design that we say we all respect. So, is our democracy in peril? What would the founders say? First, they would remind us that this is not a democracy. It is a representative republic. To confuse those two things, to celebrate so often what our founders so clearly rejected, and to ignore so thoroughly what they actually designed, reveals a scope of confusion about constitutional government that perhaps speaks volumes about our current troubles. Democracy literally means rule of people, a situation in which people might be expected by right to have their way. But the Constitution forms something different. The people of the United States comprise the public realm that government is designed to serve. but the people themselves do not govern. Instead, they elect representatives who do. And those representatives do not rule over anyone. No one rules under the Constitution. Instead, elected representatives combine their perspectives and talents in institutions designed expressly for political interaction, fulfilling their representative responsibilities only with the involvement and agreement of others who are similarly dedicated to serving their constituents and the nation at large. E pluribus unum. The nation's motto says, out of many, one. The intentions of our founders, clear from the design of the Constitution, was that representative government would be a shared responsibility, shared among people from different places, representing different interests and perspectives, and who therefore almost inevitably would differ in their aim to serve us all. But in those differences, in the necessarily political character of governing interactions, are found the power of the Union, the source of an enormous wealth of ideas and inspirations, combining to produce an almost unimaginable set of possibilities and potential. I say this is clear from the design of the Constitution. Let's be clear about that. Let's look at what the Constitution actually says. The preamble starts proudly with 3 words, we the people. It proclaims in those 3 words that what we establish and ordain by constitutional government is for all of us together. The preamble says our Constitution exists in order to form a more perfect union. Thus, from the get-go, in our highest proclamations, we Americans admit that we are not perfect. There is no shame or lack of patriotism in calling out our public flaws. Our lapses of justice, our failures of imagination, our all too frequent surrender to ignorance and selfishness. For the commitment of governing under the Constitution is always to do better. It says so right at the top. Or look at the seal of the United States that you find on a dollar bill. The pyramid is unfinished, building toward the approving eye of God, but founded on a structure grounded in revolution that is specifically designed to enlarge public possibility and encourage public progress. And then, in the preamble, comes a list of intentions for our government, not one at the expense of others, but all together as an overarching charter of ambition for the American people, to establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. Enthusiasm for the possibilities of government is not socialist or leftist, as we sometimes hear today. It is what the Constitution itself ordains. The defining of the nation's government begins in the very first words of Article 1, conferring legislative power on a Congress, a word that literally means walking together. Article 1 is the longest and most detailed portion of the Constitution, suggesting its central importance in the founders' plan of government. In our love of celebrity and simplicity today, we tend to think of the presidency as the central authority of government, but the Constitution designs something quite different. It puts most of the governing power in the complex political deliberations of Congress, tied by local representation to the people. It defines 2 distinct chambers of legislative action, a House and a Senate, which, as the 2 eyes and ears of the nation, have differing angles of perception, something that gives the politics of legislating completeness and depth of perspective that a single governing entity would not have. In its design, those 2 chambers of Congress comprise not representatives of party, for the Constitution never mentions parties, but representatives of the people from the places where they live, all different, all equal. If we're faithful to the fullness of possibility that comes with freedom, that means there will be argument and politics in legislating for the nation. And for anything to get done at all, for Congress to do its constitutional job, there will have to be respect and compromise among its members. Contrary to our perceptions of politics today, the founders saw this difficult process of deliberation and interaction as a cherished opportunity, They referred to it as public happiness. The founders' choice of putting governing responsibility in the hands of elected representatives has profound implications for those representatives, and for us too. In the task they are given, elected representatives must see to the governing needs of all the people in the region they represent, not just the ones who voted for them. The Constitution does not recognize a special privilege for parties or interest groups or even majorities. Its command is government of the people, generally, with no exceptions. This means a representative has to weigh the inevitably varying and often conflicting interests of his or her constituency in identifying public needs and in fashioning governing solutions. That's just the start of the difficulty. To create public policy through congressional legislation, that same representative has to secure the assent of a majority of other representatives from other states and other congressional districts who have their own duties to their varied constituencies. Quite obviously, this job calls for refined political skill, quickness in adapting to an always varied and ever-changing public world, capacity for respecting adversaries and finding points of compromise, intuition that grasps what is important to the people even if they do not see it themselves. By confusing our republic with a democracy, we obscure all this. Our role as citizens and voters is not to insist that we each get our way, but to choose wisely those who would govern on behalf of us all. That role, that choice, requires more than a passing judgment or surrender to the temptations of celebrity and demagoguery. Our whole nation is at stake. We vote too often now for those who literally brag about their lack of political experience. This has given us representatives who are ever louder, ever more outrageous, ever angrier and vindictive, ever more rigid and uncompromising, ever more prone to blame others for problems we all share, but few who can make government work. Whatever our reasons for preferring charlatans, the fact remains that constitutional government is built on representation, and representation requires political skill. Article 1 of the Constitution also tells us that the Congress we elect is designed to be powerful, not incidental to a confederation of states, but a committed legislative voice of the nation as a whole. We fought a civil war to reaffirm this principle, though it should be clear enough from the Constitution itself. Section 8 of Article 1 lists a set of general legislative powers for Congress with sweeping scope, and since the early days of the Republic, it has been understood that Congress may do whatever is necessary and proper as Congress sees fit to exercise those powers, so long as the exercise is within the bounds of the Constitution. The Supremacy Clause in Article 6 says explicitly that laws made by Congress pursuant to the Constitution are the supreme law of the land, state laws, offices, and powers notwithstanding. The fashions of the day tell us that government, especially national government, is evil, that it is to be strictly limited, or that we should prefer businessmen over politicians to guide us. The Constitution has a different view. It is emphatically a plan of government, and a proud one at that. And it says not a word about economics or any preference that should be given to profit-making or market outcomes. Businessmen may, in pursuit of their commercial domains, try to convince us that taxes and regulation are the essence of tyranny, contrary to the freedom the founders had in mind. But that does not comport with our history or with our founding documents. The Declaration of Independence embraces representative government as an imperative of political freedom, not as an enemy that must be subjugated to private interest. The impetus for the Revolutionary War was not no taxes, but no taxes without representation. I said before that it's a mistake to consider American government as resting in any special or exclusive way on the presidency. Not only does this misread the Constitution, it is dangerous. Looking over the founders' deliberations in designing the presidential office, one is struck immediately by their consistent fear that they not create an American monarchy, something the bloody Revolutionary War had just successfully abolished. Much as we may wish for the clarity of authoritarian decision in fractious times, there is little more un-American than the idea of one-man rule. It goes against everything the nation was founded on. By contrast with the detailed and careful design of Congress in Article 1, Article 2's design of the presidency has much less to say. There is a description of the process for choosing presidents, a requirement for citizenship, clarification of the relationship between the president and vice president, and the specification of the exact words of the president's oath of office. There are administrative details, like seeing to it that the laws of Congress are faithfully executed, the requirement to keep Congress apprised of the state of the Union, and the important reservation allowing for corrupt presidents to be impeached and removed from office. But the actual powers of the office are spare. The president is made commander-in-chief of the nation's military, but only its military, not its people. The president is put in charge of negotiating treaties and nominating judges and other public officials, but both these powers require advice and consent from the Senate before they can be given full effect. As the head of the executive branch, presidents can issue executive orders to federal agencies within the scope defined by Congress, but those orders only apply to the agencies, not the people at large, and Congress can always override them with legislation. As the presidential scholar Richard Neustadt once observed, presidential power does not derive from any prerogative of command available to the office, since there is little of that at all. It comes instead from the power of persuasion found in particular presidents' political skill. Working from the same constitutional design, some of our presidents have been better at this than others. Many have been effective managers of the nation's affairs. Only a few, the most politically insightful, have used the office to provide leadership that we celebrate in legend. As we have seen, the political necessities of representation require politicians to find public needs and public opportunities among the varying and conflicting desires of their constituents. To effect public policy, moreover, they must find consensus among others with whom they share the responsibilities of governing. This exceedingly difficult task, political task, for any representative is especially daunting for the president, whose constituency, unlike that of members of Congress, is the nation as a whole. Presidents cannot simply rule. Presidents cannot legislate. But presidents, if they are up to the political task, can see to the heart of the nation, setting its agenda and direction accordingly, and animating the power inherent in a plurality of people marshaled to common purposes. Think of Lincoln, saving the nation by freeing its slaves. In giving freedom to the slave, he said, we assure freedom to the free, honorable alike in what we give and what we preserve. Think of Roosevelt, bringing hope to a depressed people simply by animating the energies of community they could find in themselves. We now realize, he said, as we have never realized before, our interdependence on each other, that we cannot merely take, but that we must give as well. Think of Kennedy, who inspired us to express our public spirit in a new frontier of public action, literally reaching for the moon. Ask not what your country could do for you, he said, ask what you could do for your country. Ask not what America can do for you, ask what together we can do for the freedom of man. There is no power in the representative government designed by the Constitution for any governing official to rule, but there is in fact an important form of rule inherent in the constitutional system itself. It is the rule of law, a commitment of the people themselves to respect the laws that their elected representatives craft on their behalf. Government deriving its just powers from the consent of the governed, as the Declaration of Independence puts it. That distinctly American faith that the people will submit themselves to governing order without the need of a ruler was thrilling to the American founders. They described it as Novus Ordo Seclorum, the new order of the ages. The rule of law is deceptively simple in principle, complex and fragile in practice. As a guide for the formulation of law, it requires accommodating many necessarily conflicting motivations and concerns. Resting on natural principles of justice, law enforcement derives its power from the rule of law, but so does the tradition of civil disobedience, expressed most dramatically in the American Revolution itself. And yet, as a form of governing order, the rule of law depends always and ultimately on respect for public law and legal institutions by the people themselves. The rule of law is not an edict or a given. It is a shared commitment. Lawmaking power on behalf of the people is given to Congress in Article 1 of the Constitution, but general legal expertise and judgment are the province of the judicial branch in Article 3. The expectations for this branch are unique. Where elected officials are to be guided by the relatively free interplay of politics, the unelected courts are to be guided exclusively by settled principles of law. The intention was to prevent political choices from overrunning the rule of law that an ordered republic relies on for its very existence. Because the work of the court is separate from that of politics, and to preserve the integrity and foundational principles of law, the Constitution insulates the courts from political interactions, including the will of the voters. Decisions of the judges are appointed, not elected, and they may serve their terms for life. Decisions of the Supreme Court are final rulings of law, binding on the nation under the Supremacy Clause, and reversible only by constitutional amendment or convention. These characteristics of the judicial branch might seem to provide it with distinctly tyrannical powers. But Alexander Hamilton in Federalist 78 reassures us that the judiciary is the least dangerous branch, for it possesses no power of sword or purse, and its rulings are confined only to questions of law brought before it. All this makes sense if we perceive the courts as experts of law that they're supposed to be, and as possessing refined and respected experience with judging, distinct from the adversarial advocacy we respect from other lawyers. But if there is any doubt on this, if, for example, a political party were to fill the courts with advocates and ideologues dedicated to advancing that party's agenda, then the least dangerous branch becomes something altogether different. That situation provides an opportunity for unilateral rule, insulated from the wisdom of pluralism designed into the political branches, and insulated from the will of the people, which provides the ultimate safeguard against tyranny. Even if courts so comprised did not act fully on the powers to rule without check, the public perception that law had become merely the handmaiden of a narrow and exclusive agenda would do serious damage to the rule of law on which our entire constitutional system rests. Having reviewed the Constitution itself and what it says and does not, let me now give attention to whether that system of government is in some way imperiled. Some of you probably know that when asked what form of government the newly written Constitution comprised, Benjamin Franklin replied, "A republic, if you can keep it." His remark reminds us that the endurance of our form of government rests ultimately on the willingness of the people themselves to insist that it works, something that requires us to know what we should expect of our government and our governing officials, and something that requires us to use conscientiously our power to vote, not just to get things we want for ourselves, but to ensure our government remains true to its encompassing design. The founders were not cynical men, but neither were they naive. They built a system of government that envisioned the possibility of abuse and corruption, and they included protections against the inevitable lapses and aberrations of politics, including, most basically, the protection that comes in the people's vote. One source of corruption the founders feared, perhaps above all, was the domination of government by faction. James Madison described faction as a group united by some common impulse of passion or interest, which is adverse to the rights of other citizens or the permanent and aggregate interests of the community. Faction, in other words, see government factions, in other words, see government as a tool for getting their way, only their way. And Madison called this evil and violent, totally incompatible with the Constitution's representative imperatives. With his usual wisdom, Madison acknowledged that the tendency toward faction is sown in the nature of man, and that the right to organize politically for any purpose is protected, so that factions cannot be simply prohibited. But Madison in Federalist 10 was optimistic that the threat of faction to the newly designed republic would be controlled by the form of the republic itself. He pointed out that a government based on representation on behalf of everyone, rather than a democracy in which individuals would insist on getting their way, naturally dampened the ability of factions to get control. Madison argued that any elected representative who seemed to put the interest of a particular faction ahead of that of the people generally would be voted out of office. Madison also pointed out that the Constitution's focus on representation of the general population took advantage of the natural plurality of the nation and thus limited the ability of any one factional interest to prevail. Federalist 10 is sometimes read as an argument against political parties, and indeed the natural tendency toward faction almost immediately expressed itself in our new republic in the formation of political parties. Washington, in particular, saw this development as ominous. But political parties, though they are not sanctioned by the Constitution, are not necessarily factions. A predominantly two-party system has existed in the United States since the early days of the Republic, but those parties have not to this point impaired the functioning of the Republic as it is designed in the Constitution. This is true because political parties have acted less as uncompromising factions than as engines of coordinated public policy proposals that provide alternative solutions to public problems. It is also true because our elected representatives have not consistently put their party's interest ahead of their constituents' interest or the national interest. And it is true because the two parties have largely competed for support of the center, since in a two-party system, becoming too extreme risks losing the electoral support necessary to win elections. I understand the need to be fair and nonpartisan in describing the systematic features of our politics. I know that the tradition of this organization is rooted in that commitment. But if we are to be honest and clear about the threats to our constitutional order, we must be willing to speak frankly and specifically about the sources of those threats, even if that means singling out and criticizing one of our two political parties. It is time, perhaps past time, that we acknowledge what we have all been watching and absorbing for a period of years. The most dramatic change in American politics across those years has been the change in the behavior of the Republican Party in its approach to politics and governance, an approach that has become increasingly and distinctly factional in its form and hostile to the very idea of representative government in its aims. In the 2012 book by Mann and Ornstein that I referred to at the outset, the two political scientists described the Republican Party as having become ideologically extreme, contemptuous of inherited policy, scornful of compromise, unpersuaded by facts, evidence, and science, dismissive of the legitimacy of its political opponents, and all but declaring war on government. In today's political environment, where everything is cast as a binary and starkly oppositional thing, one might be inclined to dismiss such charges as familiar partisan hackery that we hear every day. But given the stakes for our constitutional governance, the observation deserves more careful consideration than that. Most Republicans I know, despite their reverence for the Constitution, readily admit their hostility to government, which many of them now perceive as an a priori encroachment on their personal freedom. Republicans are now instantly intolerant of any deviation from their party line and any hint of agreement or compromise with Democrats, whom they refer to with open contempt. Consider the recent sanctions against Liz Cheney, who, despite unquestionable Republican credentials, had the temerity to criticize the recent Republican president. Or the frequency with which Republicans threaten to primary any Republican anywhere in the country who fails to conform to their party's ideological expectations. Consider how quickly and routinely Republicans now reject public institutions they once embraced and even cherished, including public education, a free press, science, public health, the military chiefs of staff, and even the FBI. And most critical to the point I was asked to speak about this evening, consider the unique and alarming hostility Republicans now openly show to the processes of voting and acceptance of electoral decisions. Until recently, when American political parties saw flagging support for their policies or conduct in office, they made changes to recapture majority appeal needed for elections, to win elections. Republicans in recent years have taken a different course. Rather than change their policies or approaches, they have instead sought to take maximum advantage of those aspects of the constitutional design that allow governance without majority support. The Senate, which gives equal representation to states regardless of population. The Electoral College, which, as we know, can deliver the presidency to a candidate who comes up short by millions of votes. And the courts, which by design owe no allegiance to the people's will at all. Besides this, Republicans have taken maximum advantage of political tactics to block all but their own agendas and imperatives. Filibuster in the Senate, gerrymandering in state legislatures, voting laws impairing those who might vote against them, and by turns of obstruction and rank opportunism, packing the federal judiciary with judges whose only qualification for office, even amid serious questions of legitimacy, is certainty that the judge will rule in the party's favored way. In their hostility to those they see as political opponents, Republicans make no effort to compromise for the general public good with any consideration for those, sometimes comprising a majority, who voted against them. For Republicans, it is winner take all. Compromise itself is seen as a sign of weakness and a ticket out of the party. In contrast to a constitutional scheme that is built on mutual respect and plurality, Republican policies and pronouncements often seem designed merely for spite, for owning the libs, as we sometimes hear. Mann and Ornstein describe this as a mismatch between strictly party-oriented behavior and the broadly representative imperatives of our constitutional scheme. In this way of looking at things, Republicans have come to behave like European parliamentary parties, where winner take all is the norm and where party dominance is the goal. I'm not sure Republicans themselves would find that description necessarily troubling. It's just smart politics, they might say. But another way to look at this, a perspective that should be troubling to all Americans, is to recognize that the Republican Party has come to behave exactly like the uncompromising factions the founders feared and warned us against. Consider Washington's warnings about the dangers of the spirit of party, which he described as the worst enemy of constitutional government. It serves always to distract the public councils and enfeeble the public administration, he said. It agitates the community with ill-founded jealousies and false alarms, kindles animosity of one part against another, foments occasional riot and insurrection. It opens the door to foreign influence and corruption, which finds a facilitated access to the government itself through the channels of party passions. Washington recognized exactly how the disorders induced by factional party behavior would build on themselves, inducing temptations that would present even more perilous dangers to the constitutional order. The alternative domination of one faction over another, he said, sharpened by the spirit of revenge natural to party dissension, which in different ages and countries have perpetuated the most horrid enormities, is itself a frightful despotism. But this leads at length to a more formal and permanent despotism. The disorders and miseries which result gradually incline the minds of men to seek security and repose in the absolute power of an individual. And sooner or later, the chief of some prevailing faction, more able or more fortunate than his competitors, turns this disposition to the purposes of his own elevation on the ruins of public liberty. The first step in solving any problem is recognizing there is one, and that recognition needs to be kept within proper scope. Our current problems are less traceable to flaws in our constitutional design than they are to overt, readily observable failures to respect and follow that design. Americans can do much more to understand the form of government they have, why it has worked so brilliantly, and why it is in our interest to save it and pass it on to the latest generation. And they can vote much more conscientiously with those aims in mind. We all want our country to be great again, or perhaps to be great still. But the lessons of our history, passing down from the most noble beginnings, teach us that greatness is not found in reversion to confederations of bullying tribes or in the daily perpetuation of hatred and grievance toward each other. Our system is built on plurality and respect and compromise for the good of all, and we have always been at our best when we tap into that power. Thank you for listening. Sir.
So, what do you speculate as to how we got this position in the first place?
Oh, that's such a complicated, the question has such a complicated answer. The thing that I talk a lot about with my students that seems most obvious to me, and maybe something that we need to think about as needing attention in our system, is the effect of mass media. Mass media was not known to the founders at the time the Constitution was created. And the lessons of the 20th century teach us that much as we might enjoy certain advantages from mass media, it also has a terrible potential for totalitarian excess. And so there is a possibility that that's really much of what's at work here, that Americans have simply fallen under the spell of mass media propaganda, which tells them every day, I listen to it every day, how awful the other side is, how much the other side is trying to destroy the country, which creates a sense of urgency. I don't know that it's that simple, but that's a possibility. Yes, ma'am.
I want to make sure you speak up so it will capture.
Repeat the question for the Facebook
I will.
audience.
If our majority party is through our vote, how do we educate, do you suggest the population to be critical voters?
I think one of the, I do that every day. The question was, how do we educate people to be critical voters? We don't do a very good job of teaching civics anymore. We could do a much better job of that, and we could insist on it as citizens, as people who are actually in charge of our public education, that happen. I think it's essential. But in the meantime, one of the things that I have found, it's so difficult to teach people politics in this time because everything is laden with the assumption of partisanship. But still, at least for the time being, the Constitution is respected. And if you can convey the sense that you understand the Constitution, that you respect the Constitution, that you're trying to do what the Constitution requires, that does tend to get people to listen to you.
And we do that through letters to the editor? What do we do?
To talking to each other. Well, of course, those things, but certainly in talking to each other. I sent my students home at Thanksgiving knowing fully, they're freshmen, knowing fully well they're going to do the sophomoric thing, which is, my professor said this in class. This year I loaded them up with a review sheet that reminded them of all the things that they learned about the Constitution. And when they came back, I asked them, how'd it go? You know, how was Uncle Fox News receptive to the things that you said? And the answer was pretty encouraging. They liked it. They were impressed. Maybe there's hope. Other questions? Carter.
If you don't mind, I'd like to ask a question about the content of your talk. As you mentioned, the Republican Party, in no small part, is acting in a manner that would be expected of a political party in any other Western democracy. Their behavior in terms of how they approach governing, how they approach dealing with the opposition party, is in line with what you would expect in any other Western democracy and in any other Western political party. Mm-hmm. Additionally, in terms of factionalism, I'm sure I don't have to mention to you that from the beginning of the adoption of our constitutional system of government, from the era of George Washington and John Adams, factionalism has been an ever-present element of our constitutional system, at least in terms of our de facto constitutional system, regardless of what the founders wanted in the de jure constitutional system. Mm-hmm. The question I'm trying to get to is, to what degree would you say that what we are facing are issues with weaknesses with the structure of the Constitution in terms of how it interacts with how governance actually functions, versus it being a matter of either or both parties diverging from the ideals set forth in the Constitution?
Wow, big question. I'm aware of all of the things that you mentioned. I'm aware of that Republican Party is behaving, as Mann and Ornstein said, and as I said, like a European parliamentary system. Those governments are suffering to some extent from the same problems that we're seeing right now, but they've worked pretty well in the past, and so has our government worked well in the past, despite what you say correctly, that there have been elements of faction all along. Faction in the modern sense is, we just have a word for that, or words for that. We call it special interest groups, and we all hate special interest groups. So of course, this behavior has been present all along in the system that we have. But it is a two-party system, a predominantly two-party system, and when the parties begin to behave as if they're the only ones with legitimacy, then we have something that does seem to run afoul of what the Constitution itself actually says. I'm conservative. I'm not inclined to go throw out the Constitution. I'm much more inclined, at least in the interim, to try to bring back the insurgent outlier, as Mann and Ornstein described the Republican Party, to try to get them to live with us and work with us and govern with us, meaning the rest of us. I'd like to see that happen. Whether it does or not, I don't know, but that's my take on that. Other questions? Yes, ma'am.
I am interested in the comments that you made about rule of law.
Okay.
And as a formal local elected official, I got that.
It's good to see you again.
Hammered on me, and I was shocked in how it was being used, because
Let me guess. You're in violation of the rule of law because you want to do such and such, and I want to do such and such differently.
In this case, I want to do something differently is I don't want you to do it.
Or I don't want you to do it.
And
Yeah.
exactly. It was like, I know we knew the scope of what we wanted
Yes.
to do. We're clear we were within the scope per the First Amendment to petition another
Yes.
group, another
Yes.
government entity. And all of a sudden we're getting inundated with communication about the rule of law. I mean, papers to read and everything, and nowhere in there could I find where we are against the rule of law. So I guess as a question is about what you said. I was very impressed when you're talking about artificial and we're getting gaslighted.
Well,
basically.
gaslighting is exactly the way to describe that. But what I would say first is to recognize that we've been in this problem for a while. One of the things that I remember when I talk to my students about the rule of law is how vociferous Republicans were in the 2000 electoral debacle that Al Gore was not conforming to the rule of law. Let me get this straight. Florida election laws say that this is what must happen, but you don't want to follow those election laws because you don't think that the outcome of the election will go your way if you do. And you're criticizing the rule of law of the other side? Does that sound familiar?
Oh boy, yeah.
Yeah. I'm not sure what to tell you about that other than what I've said generally tonight, which is we have a lot of work to do to remind ourselves of what these principles actually are. They are not weapons to be used against each other. They are commitments that we share, and unless we do that, they don't exist at all.
Thank you.
Yeah. Hi.
In the pursuit of education, could we get a copy of what you just told us tonight?
Of course. Of course. I'll make that. I sent one to John, but that was at 1:30, and I made my usual 50 changes since I put that out. Carolyn?
This will also be available on Facebook, and we'll probably put it on YouTube also. So if you need Christmas entertainment, say I've got an hour here of learning civics lessons. So thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
I think what I'm taking away from this is in our toolbox to persuade people to vote and to vote conscientiously, to start quoting small pieces of the Constitution. You see what I'm saying? That the Constitution says this, and we say it in a nice way, and it's sort of a subhead to any kind of comments we make about, how to vote. I like that a lot because people are saying Constitution, they don't read it, they don't know about it. So just excerpting.
And there is a certain assumption that those that disagree with you are somehow against the Constitution. I hear this all the time. And that's in some reason why to go back to the Constitution and to cite it if necessary, I agree with you, is it kind of diffuses the animosity that otherwise might arise because the presumptions then don't quite fit.
Sort of in a marketable way, in other words.
Yeah. Problem is it's a big document and it's hard to know. You said small pieces. I'm not sure what the small pieces are, but if they took anything away from it tonight, it's that we do not have a democracy. We have a representative republic, and that means our government is only as good as the representatives we elect, and we need to give that attention. The good of the country depends on it. Yes, ma'am.
I'm not sure if this question is within the scope of your talk.
Oh, that's okay. I do this all the time in classrooms.
So money has always played a part in politics. Is it?
Not as much as it does now. Not as much as it does now.
Okay.
And the distinction, the thing I usually talk about is that money is certainly a terrible problem in because it creates inequities. The court in Buckley versus Valeo, I think, just missed the boat entirely, saying that money is speech and that we need to think about that. No. You and I talking to each other have freedom of speech. But if your talking is amplified by $5 billion, you have much more speech than I do. So I always say it's not the money so much as what the money gets used for. And what it gets used for is mass media. So the problem is really much more in the way that we do our politics, the way we do our campaigning. And it's not anymore just the campaigning, it's also in governance, using mass media as a sort of public relations tool. David Obey once described Congress in recent years as being just a running political commercial. That's all that's really for. We could do something about that. It's tricky with the First Amendment, but the integrity of our political process should not be open to just ridiculous successes of mass media, and money is really what's behind that. It's true in some respect If you have a lot of money, you can campaign more and so on and so forth, but the money doesn't get used for that. It gets used for mass media. An ad buy in the last 2 weeks of a campaign that blows away months or maybe even years of grassroots work that's gone on otherwise. That's where the money's going. What else?
No, that's good.
Okay. John?
I just would like you to talk a little bit about how our democracy has evolved. And this question in my mind was triggered by a 2020 decision by Elect Kagan, Justice Kagan, involving a faithless elector from the state of Washington.
Yeah.
And she just mentioned that we did not have universal popular vote for presidential election until 1837. Prior to that time, various states.
It varied from state to state, yeah.
So, and then we've had the 15th Amendment, the 20th Amendment, the 16th Amendment, all kinds of things changing the way in which our Congress and our president are selected. Who gets the vote? It started out with just men of property. Now it's different. So,
In order to form a more perfect union?
would our founding fathers have, how would they react if they came back and saw what we had?
I can answer that. You may not like the answer. A lot of my students don't like the answer because it seems so antiquated. But let's talk for a minute about the Electoral College. The Electoral College is a Congress. The Electoral College, in its original design, it's the longest part of Article 2, the long description of how the Electoral College, well, there's a reason for that. Because it's like Article 1. It's a description of a process for choosing presidents by a political negotiation among representatives. Now, you can argue with me if you want to about whether we should have the Electoral College, but your question was, what would the founders have had in mind? What the founders had in mind with their important decisions like this should always be handled in a pluralistic way by people who know what they're doing on behalf of everybody else. You and I've talked about the fact that the Senate was not originally designed to be popularly elected. The Senate was always put in place by state legislatures because the state legislatures were the professional politicians who knew something about politics, and the Senate, different from the House, was supposed to be the old ones, the ones who are careful and wise and cautious. So that's the framework in which their thinking arose. Now, of course, we can talk about making changes to this sort of thing, but I don't think we should throw away the idea that deliberation is better than just numbers. That we don't need to make any distinction whatsoever about the political skill of the people who are charged with representing us. And we should be able to sort that sort of thing out. It's just whoever has the right hair color and so on and so forth. I think deliberation is important. I think it's an absolutely essential part of the Constitution. The founders did too. And in the respect of why did they keep things in the way that where legislatures could choose the electors, it's from that same idea. The state legislatures in their thinking were the deliberative bodies who would give serious consideration to who the electors should be, as opposed to whatever happens as a result of the voters at large. We've moved more and more toward democracy. Maybe in some respects that's good, but you asked me about what the founders would say, that's what they would probably say.
So do you see, is there a tension or an almost a struggle between representative republic and democracy?
I don't see it that way. It's possible, but I see it usually, I've talked to you about this. We have a representative system of government. We have a representative republic, but there is a democratic component to it, and it is our voting. Americans voting, which is central to the system, is democratic. It's completely democratic. The founders didn't knock us out of the system entirely. Everything is dependent in one way or another on the voters. Even in the system I just described, where do those state legislators come from? They come from the votes of the people. So I wouldn't say it as a tension, but we need to understand that it's not pure democracy, which we may wish for, nor is it ignoring the people's wishes. So, yes?
In order to shore up our attempt at a more perfect union, would you speak to For the People Act? Would you see that as helping the John Lewis Voting Act?
In the original, I haven't read the bill since, I mean, they amend it like every month now to try to pull in Manchin and others, but the original bill was just stupendous. I read it completely and I was in awe. I mean, it's like, it's of the caliber of the Civil Rights Act. This is stuff we should have done a long, long, long time ago. And I don't find anything, given what I just said, I don't find anything particularly controversial about it. I know what Mitch McConnell has said about it, but he says that kind of stuff all the time. It's mostly just reaffirming the idea that voting is central to what we do, that the processes should be as open and transparent as possible, that we should have some confidence in those systems. And then there's a whole bunch of stuff like the John Lewis part of the act and the protection of certain forms of voting that, you know, those make a lot of sense in the 21st century. Yeah, I loved that act, and I hope they pass it in some form that is close to what they originally started with. Yes, ma'am?
To elaborate a bit on the idea of political skills. What are those skills?
Oh, I love to talk about this. How many hours do you have? I teach an article that was written in 1977 by Henry Fairley, the British political scientist, columnist. It's called The Politician's Art. I teach it in every class that I can get away with because that's exactly what it's about. How do you tell the difference between somebody who's really good at politics and somebody who isn't? I talked a little bit about it in my speech. To really broadly summarize, people who have a capacity for flexibility and adaptability in public pronouncements. And this is interesting because what do we do when we talk about politicians? We almost immediately criticize them for flip-flopping or for being slimy or for not being pinned down on anything. That's part of the political art. If you're representing a constituency that can't even agree with itself, of course you would be foolish to pin yourself to any particular point of view until you can find where the center of mass is. So flexibility, adaptability, very much so. Another thing that I think shows up really easily is people who enjoy politics. And by that I don't mean killing each other on TV. I mean they love the give and take. They love the situation when something that happens out of the blue throws everything into complete chaos, and then they can come and say, good, now I have something to work on. Now I can show how good I am at finding public solutions. People who can do that, it shows. They like what they do. And they're ambitious. Not necessarily, their ego is a big part of it, of course, but it's not just ego. They're ambitious for the challenge of politics. They want to go to the next level to see whether they have the chops to be able to handle that. That shows also. And then finally, again, as a sort of summary, I'd say people who show that they have a sort of intuition, that they can figure out, without having to take a poll, where people are. What is it that's on their mind? Now this goes a little bit to what I was talking to you about. This means politicians need to get out from behind the TV sets and begin instead to go talk to people face to face. Democrats need to do this especially right now, and especially in this state, which is rural. Get out there and talk to people face to face and figure out what they're about. And if you're good at that, you'll develop the intuitions for figuring that out. You don't need to talk to every single person. You can infer this just from the people that you talk to. I think we all have all of these capacities to some extent. You practice it, you get good at it, it begins to show, and those are the kinds of people we want to send to Washington or Des Moines or any other place where there's representative government. That would be my answer. Yes?
Considering what you teach, are you feeling any imminent restriction of your freedoms to teach what you...
No.
Okay, good.
Not so far. I won't be teaching much longer if I do begin to feel that, but yes, I feel pretty free to say these things. I am really, really careful, not so much because anything in the administration or the university is telling me what I need to say, but because if I don't say it in a way that gets through to my students, I'm wasting my time and theirs too. So I need to be careful in the way that I talk about things so that they don't just immediately dismiss me either as the Marxist because I'm the college professor or the crazy conservative. Most of my students think that if they're anything, I'm one or the other, and they've got it completely wrong. So I think I must be succeeding in that respect. But most of them listen, and that usually just becomes because I try really hard to figure out ways to do that, which, frankly, I think your organization has the same problem. You have to figure out a way to not compromise your heartfelt concern for the good of the Republic and get through to people without seeming to be partisan in some way. And I hope I did nothing tonight to mess that up. Yes, sir?
What role do you think faith should have in politics?
Religious faith? It's built out of our system for a very good reason, but of course, how can anyone, a person of faith, not carry that into everything that they do, including government? It's built out of our system, incidentally, because if you are faithful, if your belief in things is rooted in faith, then by definition, it is rooted in something that you believe, irrespective of what evidence or reason is offered to you. You just believe it. It's supposed to be that way. You don't expect somebody to prove to you what you believe, you just believe it. That's great for religion. That's the way it's supposed to be. You shouldn't have to compromise in religion. But it's terrible for politics, because under those circumstances, then we don't have to give reasons to each other for why we do things. We just impose them and say, that's the way it is. So the separation of church and state that's built into the system is to protect faith and people of faith from the pollution of the political realm, and to protect the political realm from the tyranny of a world that says, or a belief that says, this is the way it has to be and we're not going to discuss it with you. Beyond that, I'm not sure what else to say. I can follow up if you have something else you want to ask.
Yeah, I mean, faith kind of determines what you believe right and wrong is.
Of course, of course. And we don't have, it's an old syllogism I remember from high school. You don't have to be of a particular religious faith or any religious faith to understand moral concepts. But I would also say that moral concepts are not really what governing is about. Governing is about interest. Governing is about, there are laws against murder, and those are rooted in religious and moral convictions. But they're also rooted in the idea that the state has a reason to want to protect our health and safety, and that's an interest. That's not necessarily a moral precept. The difference is important because you can defend interests. If, for example, you want to curtail a fundamental right, you have to be able to give reasons for doing that. You can't just say, well, I just believe this and that's the way it goes. So interests are important as a device for telling us why our moral convictions should be reflected in our laws and our policies. But we have to do it in that way as opposed to saying it's just the way it is, no discussion allowed. I don't know whether that addressed what you were trying to ask me, but I hope it did. Yes, ma'am.
Who do you feel historically was our most effective president?
I never answer favorite questions. I gave you 3. Wasn't that good enough?
I know you said those 3, and that's in literature everywhere. Those are the most 3 effective. Were they effective both inspirationally and as far as being effective?
The last lesson I teach my students in American politics, which I just finished this week, is how do we define political greatness? Why is it that presidents who are really popular, like Barack Obama or Ronald Reagan, are not rated as great presidents? Why is Teddy Roosevelt up there? Why is Franklin Roosevelt up there? Why is Washington and Lincoln? Why is Kennedy up there, even though he only served for 1,000 days? And the answer I always give my students, which is just mine, it's just my opinion, is that those presidents enlarged public possibility. They gave us a sense that we were bigger than we thought we were, that we could do more than we thought we could, which is remarkable given the really small amount of authority that a president is actually given by the Constitution. That's just consummate political leadership. And the people that could do that, no matter who they are and wherever it occurs, even, lowly members of, county commissions, that's a great thing to be able to do, and we should celebrate it and find it. Yes?
What is your read on the effect of America's increased involvement in foreign affairs post-World War II on the powers of the presidency, given the presidency is both empowered to conduct foreign policy as well as ultimately to oversee the national security of the United States?
Well,
as Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces.
Yeah. Do I detect in your questions some concern about that on your own part? Are presidents too powerful as a result of foreign entanglements?
That's my concern.
I was just asking for your opinion on the effects of those factors on a...
I think it helps to explain why the presidency has been elevated. The imperial president, as Arthur Schlesinger used to complain about it, it arises in some respects of that, and it arises not necessarily out of malice or failure, but in some respects because of just some interesting novel circumstances of the 20th century. In particular, the president is understood because of the role as the single person who is the face of the country in negotiating treaties, as the sort of face of the foreign policy of the United States. We can't send 535 members of Congress to go negotiate with the Soviet Union. We need a single face to do that, and we send the president to do that. And the courts in cases like Curtis Wright have said, yes, the president has almost plenary powers in foreign affairs. I don't agree with that, but that is a common understanding. What happens when you have something like the United Nations Charter, which basically just abolishes war and says that everything now is going to be a political discussion as a matter of relations between nations? An enormous elevation of the capabilities of the president to decide things on our behalf under those circumstances. We don't declare war anymore because you can't. It's illegal. And so what happens instead is the president engages in a police action, or Congress writes the AUMF, the Universal Authorization for, go find an enemy someplace, figure out what you want to do about it, do it, and if you want to, stop there, but just keep going otherwise, and the AUMF is still in effect. Yeah, that is deeply troubling, and we ought to do something about it. But as I've said to you and others before, that's not going to happen until we get our politics straight. That's not going to happen until we can begin to talk to each other about things, because then it just gets laden with, you hate our presidents and we hate yours.
If you don't mind me just asking quickly, what would you say the effect of nuclear weapons are on the office of the presidency in regards to the previous question?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure that changes anything at all. It's just part of the general elevation. I mean, it obviously dramatizes the elevation of presidential decision-making in foreign affairs, but I don't know that it necessarily changes it. I teach my students from the example of the Cuban Missile Crisis, because in my opinion, that crisis shows the absolute pinnacle of presidential leadership. No, you don't get to just have your way in the world. You have to figure out how to, because we'll annihilate each other if we don't. But that's a scary place to put presidents in. I'm not so concerned, Carter, about nuclear weapons as much anymore. I lived through the Cold War and so on and so forth. I think there's a lot of other things that we should be as much or more concerned about, like drone strikes and things like that. But again, we have such a hill to climb to get our politics to the point where we can actually have a reasonable discussion about these things. And so I don't want to sound pessimistic, but I feel like that just seems to be over another hill. Yes, ma'am. The first one came out in 2012, and the second one came out in 2016. And as far as I know, they've been writing other stuff since then, so I guess they've sort of given up on this project. I'm sorry?
Very generous, very generous.
Thank you.
My pleasure. I'll stick around for a few minutes if you want to ask me a few more questions.